The room went quiet for 11 seconds. An American colonel, a man who had served in Korea and had 2 tours of Vietnam behind him, was sitting across a folding table from a British brigadier in a prefabricated operations room somewhere in the Persian Gulf region in the early 1990s. The colonel had just laid out his proposed command structure for joint operations. It was detailed, it was thorough. It allocated the British SAS element a supporting role within an American command chain, subordinate to American intelligence tasking, subject to American targeting approval, obligated to American planning timelines. The brigadier read it to the bottom. He set it down. He looked at the colonel without any particular emotion and said 7 words. "We have forgotten more about this than you know." And then he slid the document back across the table. That line was not arrogance. It was not inter-allied friction dressed up in a polished phrase. It was a statement of institutional fact, delivered by a man whose regiment had been fighting insurgencies, jungle wars, desert campaigns, and covert proxy conflicts continuously since 1941. By the time American Special Operations Doctrine had been codified, the British SAS had already conducted successful counterinsurgency operations across Malaya, Borneo, Oman, Aden, and more than 2 decades of the most technically demanding covert work in Western Europe. The Americans had Vietnam. The British had a library. This is the story of how that library was built. Not in classrooms, not in war colleges, not in doctrine manuals written by officers who had never smelled the specific rot of a Malayan jungle at 0300 in the monsoon season. It was built in the field, one campaign at a time, by soldiers who learned what worked and what killed you, and who passed that knowledge forward with the rigor of men who understood that the next generation would need it. It begins in 1948, in a jungle so dense and so hostile that early British commanders had no coherent framework for fighting in it. The Malayan emergency was declared on the 17th of June, 1948, after the Malayan National Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Malayan Communist Party, began attacking rubber plantations, tin mines, and police stations across the peninsula. The MNLA began attacking rubber plantations, mines, and police stations, derailing trains and burning workers' houses. The men leading this insurgency were not amateurs. The leader of the Malayan Communist Party, Chin Peng, along with his allies, fled into the jungle and formed the MNLA to wage a war for national liberation against British colonial rule. Many MNLA fighters were veterans of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, a communist guerrilla army previously trained, armed and funded by the British to fight the Japanese occupation. The British had armed these men, trained them, taught them to survive in terrain. Most British soldiers could barely navigate in daylight. Now those same men were using those skills against their former tutors. The irony was not lost on anyone. The lesson it contained was not immediately absorbed. The Malayan emergency was one of the few successful counterinsurgency operations undertaken by the Western powers during the Cold War. But it did not begin that way. The first 3 years were characterized by confusion, tactical mistakes, and a fundamental failure to understand what kind of war this was. British infantry battalions arriving from Europe attempted to apply conventional military logic to an environment that destroyed conventional military logic. They patrolled in formation, they set up fixed positions, they responded to contact. The jungle swallowed them whole. Men died from heat stroke, from dysentery, from malaria, from ambushes they never heard coming until the first rounds were already in them. The MNLA, who knew every game trail and river line and canopy gap in a jungle they had been living in for 3 years, simply melted away and reappeared somewhere else. The British were not stupid. They noticed they were losing and started trying to understand why. The man who began to crystallize the answer was Major Walter Walker, a Gurkha officer who had fought the Japanese through the jungles of Burma and arrived in Malaya, bristling, as one observer later noted, with ideas. Walker's immediate role was to train and equip the irregular ferret force. In late 1948, he was appointed commandant of the Far East Training Center in Johor Bahru with the task of training British units arriving from the UK in jungle fighting. What Walker brought to that task was not just technical competence. It was the beginning of something the British military had never quite formalized before: the systematic extraction of lessons from ongoing conflict and their immediate conversion into training doctrine. Walker wrote the definitive Anti-Terrorist Operational Manual, a document that would eventually become known as the Conduct of Anti-Terrorist Operations in Malaya. Everyone called it ATOM. It was not a theoretical work. Every paragraph of it had been purchased with dead British soldiers and hard operational failure. At the same time, another man was working at the strategic level of the same problem. Major Mike Calvert, known throughout the wartime SAS as Mad Mike, had commanded the SAS Brigade in the final year of the Second World War and had watched the regiment be disbanded in 1945 with the contemptuous efficiency of a war office that didn't understand what it had. Major Michael Mad Mike Calvert, a veteran of the Chindits and former commander of the SAS Brigade, was tasked with assessing the insurgency. Calvert spent 6 months conducting a covert survey of the region, reportedly traveling 1,500 miles and gathering intelligence from various local sources. He walked into the insurgency with the eye of a man who had spent years in exactly this kind of war. What he brought back was a prescription that a conventional British headquarters found uncomfortable. Calvert argued for the reintroduction of a long-range penetration unit capable of living and fighting in the jungle for extended periods. These recommendations became a core component of the Briggs Plan, a comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy that also included the forced relocation of rural populations into new villages to cut off insurgent supply lines. The Briggs Plan was the first coherent framework the British had produced for this kind of conflict. It recognized something that every later British counterinsurgency effort would build on as bedrock. You cannot defeat an insurgency by military means alone. You defeat it by severing the insurgent from his base of popular support, denying him food, intelligence, recruits, and sanctuary among the civilian population, and simultaneously giving that same civilian population a reason to choose your side over his. In 1950, Calvert received permission to raise the Malayan Scouts, Special Air Service Regiment. A squadron was primarily composed of former members of the Chindits, a special forces unit of the British Indian Army during World War II, and veterans of Ferret Force, which included former Special Operations Executive Agents and jungle warfare specialists from the Royal Malay Regiment and the Gurkha Rifles. In 1950, the SAS, known initially as the Malayan Scouts, became involved in the campaign and remained there until 1958. This was the rebirth of the SAS from its post-war demise, and it was also the catalyst that enabled the SAS to gain itself a permanent position in the UK forces' order of battle. The early Malayan Scouts were a rough outfit. The unit faced early disciplinary challenges. The original A Squadron was noted for its unconventional and often unprofessional behavior, which caused friction with the more traditionally disciplined B and C Squadrons. Getting the unit properly on its feet required a new commanding officer with the administrative iron to impose structure on men who had been assembled from the flotsam of Empire's various fighting forces. John Sloan arrived in late 1951 and did exactly that. In 1952, the designation Malayan Scouts was dropped, and 22 SAS Regiment came into being. The regiment that would eventually be acknowledged as the world's most capable special forces unit had found its permanent institutional form in the Malayan jungle, shaped by a counterinsurgency campaign that the rest of the world had barely noticed. What the SAS learned in Malaya was not learned from a manual. It was learned through patrol after patrol that went wrong in ways that taught the men who survived them exactly why. They learned that a 4-man patrol could live for weeks in the deep jungle if it moved correctly, ate correctly, and understood the environment at a granular level. During training, they pioneered techniques of resupply by helicopter and also set up the Hearts and Minds campaign to win over the locals with medical teams, going from village to village, treating the sick. With the aid of Ibn trackers from Borneo, they became experts at surviving in the jungle. The Ibn trackers were crucial. These were men from the indigenous populations of Borneo whose families had been reading jungle signs the way a British officer reads a map. They could follow a footprint across rock. They could tell from a bent twig how many men had passed, how long ago, which direction they were heading in. The SAS watched them work and then trained, obsessively, to develop the same skill themselves. Not to match the Ibn trackers, that was impossible, but to understand what the trackers were seeing well enough to apply that understanding operationally. Lofty Large, a legendary figure within the SAS who fought in Korea, Malaya, Oman, Borneo, and Aden, remembered. Every sense was switched on to maximum. You listened, smelled, looked for everything. You got a feel for the jungle. John Woodhouse introduced the SAS selection course in 1952 after being chosen to return to England to develop it over a period of 3 years. What Woodhouse built drew directly from the Malayan experience. The selection course he designed was built around the central insight that the qualities that kept a man alive in a Malayan jungle, navigational self-reliance, physical endurance at altitude and in bad weather, the ability to make correct decisions when exhausted and alone, could be tested and selected for in the mountains of South Wales. This was not random. The Brecon beacons were chosen because they were the closest available terrain to the operational environments the regiment anticipated fighting in. They were hostile, they were exposed, they produced casualties. They killed candidates who could not manage themselves. The men who got through were not necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the men who, under conditions of extreme physical and psychological pressure, made consistently correct decisions. That was what the jungle demanded. That was what selection measured. By the time the Malayan emergency was formally concluded in 1960, the British SAS and its associated commanders had accumulated a body of operational knowledge that no other military organization in the world possessed in the same form. They understood exactly how to find, track, and destroy a jungle insurgency whose fighters had popular support, detailed local knowledge, and years of operational experience. They had learned when to fight and when to wait. They had learned that the decisive action in a counterinsurgency was almost never a firefight. It was an intelligence operation, a defection, a development project that changed what a particular village decided to tell the jungle when the insurgents came looking for food. They had learned that the population was not the backdrop of the conflict. It was the ground the conflict was fought on. The Americans noticed. In December 1960, soon after the emergency ended, the U.S. Army's Handbook for the Suppression of Communist Guerrilla/Terrorist Operations looked to the Malayan example as one resource for practical measures that could be used against guerrilla activities the world over. That same year, the U.S. Army obtained the British Counterinsurgency Manual Conduct of Anti-Terrorist Operations in Malaya, or ATOM. Soon, all of the Army's service schools received copies of ATOM to formulate their counterinsurgency doctrine. This is a detail worth pausing on. At the precise moment the United States was beginning to escalate its involvement in Vietnam, the single most important piece of counterinsurgency doctrine in the American military school system was a British manual written by Walter Walker from his experience in a war the Americans were being told to treat as their template. They had the document. They did not have the institutional memory that produced it, and that difference turned out to matter more than the document itself. Vietnam proved the gap. The American approach in Southeast Asia was built on the assumption that overwhelming firepower, superior technology, and massive conventional force could be made to work against a guerrilla insurgency if applied with sufficient will and resources. It could not. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars had the same fundamental advantages the MNLA had enjoyed in Malaya: popular support in contested areas, intimate knowledge of terrain, the ability to dissolve before contact and reconstitute after it. But the American response was not the British response. John Nagel characterizes the U.S. military as the antithesis of the British post-imperial phenomenon. In Vietnam, an authoritarian U.S. military culture triumphed over doctrinal innovation and marginalized Kennedy's national directives. The British model had worked in Malaya because it was built on decentralized command, patient intelligence work, the cultivation of local trust, and the willingness to accept that military operations were a subordinate element of a political campaign. The American model was built on centralized command, firepower dominance, and the institutional assumption that military force applied at sufficient scale could solve political problems. In Vietnam, it could not. While Vietnam was consuming the American military's confidence in its own doctrine, the British were fighting and winning another war in a jungle 600 kilometers east of where the Malayan campaign had ended. Between 1963 and 1966, British Commonwealth forces fought against Indonesia in a conflict that focused on the future of Brunei and North Borneo. Indonesia's President Sukarno had declared confrontation against the new Federation of Malaysia, and Indonesian regular soldiers were crossing the border of Borneo in bodies of up to 200 men, attempting to establish bases in the jungle before being intercepted and driven back. The British commander was Walter Walker, who brought to Borneo exactly the counterinsurgency framework he had developed over 15 years in Malaya. Soon after assuming command in Borneo, Walker issued a directive listing the ingredients for success based on his experience in the Malayan emergency: unified operations, timely and accurate information, and winning the hearts and minds of the people. The regiment was sent to Borneo for the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation, where they adopted the tactics of patrolling up to 20 kilometers over the Indonesian border and used local tribesmen for intelligence gathering. The troops at times lived in the indigenous tribes' villages for 5 months, thereby gaining their trust. This involved showing respect for the headmen, giving gifts, and providing medical treatment for the sick. The SAS operators who did this work were not doing it as a secondary task. They were doing it as the primary task. Before a single ambush was laid, before a single cross-border patrol was planned, the regiment had to understand who lived in those jungles, what they feared, what they wanted, and whether they could be trusted. The intelligence that came from those relationships was worth more than any amount of aerial surveillance. People who trust you will tell you where the enemy spent the night. People who fear you will tell the enemy where you are. The comparatively simple medical and engineering services provided by the patrols vastly improved the villagers' lot without fundamentally altering their way of life, which many SAS troopers came to respect and admire. This is not a detail about charity. It is a detail about strategic intelligence architecture. A village that trusts the SAS patrol that has been treating its children's malaria for 3 months is a village that cannot be easily turned into an Indonesian intelligence asset. The barrier was not military. It was human. The objective of the cross-border operations, codenamed Claret, was to wrest the initiative from the enemy. From May 1964, predominantly SAS troops, operating in groups of 4, regularly patrolled territory immediately across the border. When a patrol discovered enemy guerrillas moving towards Malaysia, it would arrange for them to be ambushed as they crossed the border. Operation Claret was conducted under a strict rule. No evidence of British involvement was to be left on the Indonesian side of the border. Every patrol was deniable. Every contact was designed to be ambiguous. This was not timidity. It was the recognition that an escalated border war between Britain and Indonesia would serve no one's interests and was likely to draw in the very powers whose involvement would transform a manageable regional conflict into a Cold War flashpoint. The SAS conducted deep penetration intelligence operations inside enemy territory in complete secrecy without leaving a trace that could be used to trigger escalation. The Borneo campaign cost the British 59 killed and 123 wounded, compared to the Indonesian 600 dead. Those numbers define the asymmetry. A war fought correctly, using doctrine built over 15 years of hard experience. The same year that confrontation ended, the British SAS began another campaign that would run for a decade and produce lessons that no military force in the world had ever had to absorb before. Oman's Dhofar province had been in revolt since 1963, and by 1970 the situation was genuinely grave. By mid-1970 the situation seemed grave. In July 1970, Sultan Saeed abdicated following a bloodless palace coup orchestrated by the Crown Prince, Qaboos bin Said, and key members of the Sultan's British staff. Within hours of the coup, British Special Air Service soldiers were flown into Oman to further bolster the counterinsurgency campaign. They identified 4 main strategies that would assist the fight against the PFLOAG: civil administration and a hearts and minds campaign and medical assistance. The Dhofar campaign was, in the judgment of SAS commander Tony Jeeps, who served in and wrote about it, a classic of its type, in which every principle of counterinsurgency operations built up over the last 50 years in campaigns around the world by the British and other armies, often by trial and error, was employed. That phrase, built up over the last 50 years, often by trial and error, is the key. This was not doctrine invented for Dhofar. It was doctrine accumulated through Malaya, Borneo, Kenya, Aden, Cyprus, and a dozen smaller fires that had barely made the British press. It was the product of continuous operational learning that the British Army had been conducting since before the Second World War. The specific instrument that made the Dhofar campaign work was the Furqat system. Qaboos proclaimed an amnesty in August 1970, encouraging rebel defections and forming Furqats, tribal irregular units totaling around 1,000 men initially, trained by British SAS personnel to leverage local knowledge against insurgents. This was precisely the Malayan model adapted to desert mountains. In Malaya, the British had turned the population away from the insurgents by giving them a stake in the outcome. In Oman, the SAS was doing the same thing with surrendered enemy fighters. By 1975, the SAS administered some 1,600 men, deployed in 21 separate Furqat units. With skillful handling, they became a key element in operations to recover lost territory and win the hearts and minds of the Dhofari people. The Furqats were not easy to work with. Most refused to operate outside of their tribal areas during the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan, or when they just didn't feel like fighting. Relaying orders to them was not enough. They had to be coaxed into action through lengthy negotiations. Dhofari veteran Ian Gardner referred to leading them like herding cats. The SAS handled this not through force or threats, but through the patient application of precisely the relationship skills the regiment had been building since its first encounters with Iban trackers in Malaya. They understood that a Furqat unit that fought badly because its heart wasn't in it was worse than useless. A Furqat unit that fought because it genuinely believed in what it was fighting for was decisive. The difference between the two states was a British SAS sergeant who had spent enough time sitting in their villages, eating their food, learning enough of their language to be polite, and treating their wounded to have earned the right to be trusted. The operation was almost a carbon copy of a system that had proved successful in the Malayan emergency some 20 years previously. That sentence from the historical record deserves examination. 20 years. 2 decades of institutional memory, consciously preserved, deliberately applied to a new theater in a different region with a different enemy and a different language. The British military's ability to do that was not accidental. It was the product of a regimental culture that treated operational experience as the most precious asset it possessed and invested systematically in its preservation. Many accounts of the Dhofar Rebellion focus upon the July 1972 Battle of Mirbat, during which 9 SAS troops successfully defended their position against an estimated 200 Adu. The Battle of Mirbat has become famous because it contains every element of the story people prefer to tell about special forces. A desperate stand, massively outnumbered, ferocious personal bravery, survival against impossible odds. 9 men held a position against a force of around 300 enemy fighters, kept them out of the town, and fought until relief arrived. It is considered to be the decisive point at which the Dhofar War was won. Once communist insurgents had been beaten on that July day, they were never able to fully regain the initiative in their struggle to take over Oman. But the Battle of Mirbat, extraordinary as it was not what the Dhofar campaign taught the regiment. Mirbat was a firefight. The regiment knew how to fight. What the Dhofar campaign taught was something more subtle and more important. It taught how to build a functioning state institution, piece by piece, from scratch in a war zone, using a combination of military force, civil development, intelligence operations, and the patient cultivation of human relationships over a time scale measured in years rather than days. The Dhofar War remains one of the few examples of a successful Western-led counterinsurgency in a post-war Middle Eastern country. The Americans studying the Dhofar War in the 1980s and 1990s found it instructive but struggled with its central premise. It was simply too slow. The British had taken 5 years to win Dhofar, a campaign fought by a few hundred SAS soldiers alongside Omani forces in a province most Americans couldn't find on a map. American institutional culture, shaped by the massive conventional requirements of potential conflict with the Soviet Union and the political demands of a democratic electorate, was not structured for that kind of timeline. The American military planned for wars that lasted months, not years. It trained for decisive force and rapid resolution. The British were training for something altogether more demanding: the ability to be present, patient, and effective in a hostile environment for as long as it took, without visible result, without public support, without the kind of dramatic action that generates political will. The Northern Ireland dimension compounded this divide. The SAS's longest operational commitment was in Northern Ireland, where from 1969 until 2007, when the military operation ended, it focused on countering the Provisional Irish Republican Army. Although small teams had been working under cover since soon after the start of the Troubles, it was not until 1976 that the regiment's formal deployment was announced. It conducted intelligence, surveillance, and strike operations in support of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. The Northern Ireland campaign was unlike anything else in the British military's post-war experience, because it was conducted not in a jungle or a desert or a mountain range, but in British cities and towns, under British law, in full view of British media and a British public that held strong and violently divided opinions about everything the security forces did. The constraints were different, the stakes were different, the rules of engagement were different. Following a series of controversial incidents involving the Mobile Reconnaissance Force, the SAS were tasked with setting up a new undercover unit for surveillance operations in Northern Ireland, which became known as 14 Intelligence Company, or the DT. A special training wing of the SAS selected and trained candidates for 14 Company. SAS officers formed much of the command staff. The 14 Intelligence Company was one of the most sophisticated human intelligence instruments any Western government had ever deployed in an internal security operation. Operators who passed selection into 14 Company were trained to blend into the civilian population of Belfast and Londonderry with a completeness that went far beyond physical disguise. They understood the social codes of specific communities, the patterns of surveillance by hostile groups, the difference between a street that was being watched and a street that merely looked watched. They ran surveillance operations within meters of active PIRA cells while appearing to be ordinary members of the public. Records show that between 1976 and 1984, the SAS had killed a total of 9 terrorists. However, from 1985 to 1992, they had killed a total of 27, an increase of 300%. That acceleration was not random. It reflected a maturing intelligence architecture, a deepening understanding of the PIRA's internal structures, communication patterns, and operational habits, and the patient construction of a targeting system precise enough to intercept active service units at the moment of attack rather than after it. The SAS's most public success in Northern Ireland was in 1987 when it ambushed a large PIRA mortar team as it attacked a police station in Loughgall. 8 PIRA members died at Loughgall. It was the largest single loss the organization had suffered in the entire history of the Troubles. It was not a product of aggression or scale. It was the product of intelligence work conducted over months, source development, pattern analysis, patient waiting. The ambush itself lasted less than 90 seconds. The intelligence operation that enabled it had been running for years. This is what British veterans meant when they sat across tables from American planners in the early stages of the Gulf War, or in the initial planning discussions for operations in Afghanistan in 2001, or in the interminable joint planning sessions in the run-up to the Iraq invasion in 2003, and declined to be subordinated to American command structures in areas of British specialist expertise. It was not national pride. It was not institutional arrogance. It was the knowledge that the kind of work they were being asked to do required a specific kind of accumulated understanding that had taken decades to build and could not be improvised by officers, however talented, who were approaching the same problems for the first time. The Americans, to their credit, understood this eventually. By the beginning of 1962, American counterinsurgency doctrine had informed the U.S. Army's training programs for more than 60 client states in the Caribbean, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. They had always been trying to learn from the British experience. The difficulty was not one of will, but of culture. It was not just luck that brought together the enterprising governor of Malaya, Robert Thompson, as his colonial secretary, Generals Briggs and Templar as successive directors of operations, and Major Walter Walker, bristling with ideas from the jungle. The long-term obligations of policing the empire had created a milieu of similarly educated officers and civil servants. Military commands were decentralized and isolated garrisons learned to live with their civilian counterparts. That milieu was the thing that could not be transferred by handing over a document. The Atom Manual was excellent. The RAND studies based on British Malayan experience were thorough. The American FM 3-24 Counterinsurgency Field Manual, published in 2006, drew explicitly on British doctrine from Malaya, Borneo, and Oman. But what none of those documents could replicate was the institutional culture that produced men who had absorbed the same core lesson through 3 or 4 successive campaigns and carried it into each new deployment as intuition rather than procedure. The British officer arriving in Basra in 2003 who understood, without being told, that winning the confidence of a local police chief was worth more than any number of cordon and search operations was not applying theory. He was acting on inherited knowledge that had been blood-purchased in Malaya, refined in Borneo, tested in Oman, and sharpened across 38 years of Northern Ireland. The American unit, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, was formed by Colonel Charles Alvin Beckwith, who served with 22 SAS as an exchange officer and recognized the need for a similar type of unit in the United States Army. The founding document of Delta Force, America's Tier 1 counterterrorism unit, was written by a man who had spent a year inside the SAS and concluded that what he had seen there did not exist anywhere else in the American order of battle. Beckwith did not try to copy the SAS. He tried to build the American equivalent of the culture that produced it, and he spent the rest of his military career arguing that the American military establishment fundamentally misunderstood what that would require. What he understood, and what the British veterans who declined American command understood, was that the SAS's operational competence was not separable from its institutional continuity. The regiment that fought in Malaya in 1951 was still, in a meaningful sense, the regiment that fought in Oman in 1971, because the men who served in Malaya trained the men who served in Oman, and the men who served in Oman trained the men who served in Northern Ireland, and the lessons moved forward not just in documents, but in the hands-on transmission that happens when an experienced sergeant takes a new trooper aside and tells him not what the manual says, but what the manual doesn't say. What you actually do when the situation doesn't match the briefing. What you watch for in a specific kind of human environment that tells you the operation is about to go wrong before it does. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the SAS developed an unrivaled expertise in counter-revolutionary warfare and counterterrorism. That word, unrivaled, is not promotional language. It is an acknowledgement, by a neutral source, of something that the operational record of the regiment makes unambiguous. Between 1948 and 1980, the British SAS successfully prosecuted counterinsurgency campaigns in Malaya, Borneo, Oman, Aden, and Northern Ireland. Not one of these campaigns ended in defeat. In the same period, the United States military, working from doctrine partly derived from British experience, fought a counterinsurgency in Vietnam and lost. Not because the American soldiers were inadequate. They were not. Because the institutional framework in which those soldiers operated was not built for the kind of war Vietnam required. It had not been built that way over decades of continuous experience. It had been assembled from a combination of conventional military logic and borrowed doctrine without the institutional memory that produced it is a collection of instructions without the understanding of why each instruction exists. The understanding of why is the thing that cannot be borrowed. The Malayan emergency was one of those experiences that made the SAS the elite fighting force they are today. Officers like Calvert and Walker spearheaded a new type of counterinsurgency doctrine that would systematically destroy the MCP. That doctrine did not appear fully formed from the mind of a gifted theorist. It emerged from the mud and the heat and the failed patrols and the ambushes that did not work and the villages that would not cooperate and the intelligence that turned out to be wrong. It emerged from dead men and hard lessons and the institutional determination to make sure those lessons were not wasted. When the British brigadier slid the American planning document back across the table in that prefabricated operations room, he was not being obstructive. He was being precise. He was telling the American colonel something that was factually correct. The British regiment had been fighting the kind of war they were now both preparing for since before the American officer's father was born. The accumulated institutional knowledge of the SAS, built through Malaya and Borneo and Oman and Northern Ireland and a dozen smaller operations that never made any official record, represented something that no command structure redesign could conjure from nothing. As SAS Commander Tony Jeep stated, "The Dhofar War was a classic of its type, in which every principle of counterinsurgency operations built up over the last 50 years in campaigns around the world by the British and other armies, often by trial and error, was employed." 50 years. Trial and error. Those words define what the British veterans were protecting when they refused to accept command arrangements that would subordinate their judgment to officers who had not made those errors, had not endured those trials, had not paid the price that the knowledge cost. It was not that the Americans were incapable. It was that capability of the kind required is not a function of training alone. It is a function of time, continuity, and the willingness of an institution to treat its own hard experience as sacred. The SAS carries that experience forward, not in documents, but in men. In the sergeant who did 3 tours of Northern Ireland and then went to Iraq and knew, without being briefed, exactly why a particular street in Basra felt wrong in the same way a particular alley in Belfast had felt wrong 20 years earlier. In the troop commander who had read the Dhofar accounts, not as history, but as operational guidance, because the human dynamics of an insurgency in the mountains of southern Arabia turned out to rhyme with the human dynamics of an insurgency in the mountains of Easterns. Afghanistan in ways that a purely analytical approach would have missed. In the institution itself, which has never stopped fighting long enough to forget what it knows, and which has consequently accumulated a body of experience that no amount of money or technology or organizational reform can replicate. When veterans with that knowledge sat down opposite officers who wanted to absorb their unit into a larger command structure with American planning cycles and American targeting approval processes and American rules of engagement that had been designed for a different kind of war, they pushed back. Not always loudly, not always in ways that made the news, but consistently and with the quiet authority of men who did not need to explain themselves because the operational record explained everything. We have forgotten more about this war than you know. 7 words. 50 years of dead men in jungles and mountains and narrow streets. The most experienced counterinsurgency force in the Western world, forged in campaigns the rest of the world was still trying to study from documents, declining to be told how to do the thing it had been doing longer, better, and with less resource than anyone else alive. The document slid back across the table. The room stayed quiet for 11 seconds. Then someone reached for a coffee, and the conversation started again, this time on different terms.